Yes, we do. We have one.
Alright.
We have one. He's supposed to be coming today.
One man versus all these ladies. Okay, well let's make a start. So our plans for this morning. Can I ask, are you hearing me clearly? Because it sounds as if it's breaking up a little bit.
You're good. You're good.
You can hear me good. Oh, that's good. Okay, so plans for this morning is to go through some more of these enterprise-wide risk management slides, and then what we'll do is, when we get to a certain point in those slides where I start talking a little bit more about the board of directors' role in risk management, then what we'll do is we'll take a look at the BCCI case study, which I hope you've all got a copy of. No? Okay, well you need to shout at Miguel to get you one printed out. So that by the time we get to there, we've got a copy of BCCI. I'm sure you come back upstairs in a few moments. And then after that we go back into a few more slides, and then I'll talk to you about the risk position where one bank makes the bid to buy another bank. And it's actually an acquisition, but it's an interesting acquisition because it's what you call a hostile acquisition. So it's not a friendly one. And it's where one bank is trying to buy the other, and the other bank really doesn't want to be taken over. So it's a very interesting case to take a look at. We'll probably just get to the point where we start looking at that, and then we'll continue with that next week. And then next week we'll focus a bit more on Basel III, and I can update you, what's happening on that. Now, you might remember from last week, we got to this chart here, and we started to discuss that one of the problems in risk management is where these risks fall are not always very clear. You could think on a case, you might think, oh, this looks like a market risk position, but actually it might be market risk products, but it has an operational risk influence. And if you remember last week we did the Barings Bank case study, and the lady sitting near the front on my right-hand side, she picked up straight away that actually one of the main risks was a lack of segregation of duties, remember? So Leeson was in charge of the front office and the back office. So actually, although the products he was trading involved a market risk position, the case was more actually, at the end of the day, more about operational risk issues. So that's the complexity in risk management. Now, moving on from there, we started to talk about risk-adjusted performance, and then I introduced this relatively new concept called RAROC, the risk-adjusted return on capital, and I also mentioned to you it's also known as ROROC, the return on risk-adjusted capital. So there's two terms meaning the same thing, and it was at that point, if you remember, where I had a question towards the end of the session, could I give more information on that? Well, the answer is yes, we can. The concept was originally developed, I mentioned to you, by American consultants called Stern Stewart, and it is a relatively new concept. Now, as far as your work is concerned, towards the Chartered Banker exam, all you will need to know, is what's on these couple of slides. So you'll just have to have an idea, about what actually RAROC is. So you won't need to go deeper than that. But just because of the question last week, has the lady joined us to ask me a question?
No, she hasn't arrived yet.
She hasn't arrived yet? Okay. Well, we can get ahead of her before she arrives. There's various ways you can research these things on the internet. Coming up.
Morning.
Good morning. This is very timely because I'm just about to answer your question from last week about the return on risk-adjusted capital. Did you have a chance to do any internet research or not? No. Too busy at work. Okay, well, there's a few different publications that I came across. As I've explained to the other ladies, I don't want to cause you like a diversion because you're going to get, lots and lots of notes. As you imagine, when you've got all the 6 modules in your folder, you're going to have a lot of material. So I don't want to overwhelm you with more material on this concept. But what I will do, for those of you who want to do some further reading, and I'm going to try and get this on the screen. So let's hope it comes on the screen. Has that come on the screen, Mackenzie?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, now. I've just got a problem here. Without the owner's permission, I'm not trying to edit it. So here we can see, look, if you do a research on McKinsey, the American consultants, here we are, you'll see the use of economic capital in performance management for banks. Now this is a very comprehensive report, it's 20 pages. So all I'm going to do for the moment is just to show you the contents there. Look, can everybody see that?
Yes.
So on page 9 of this article, you can see setting RAROC targets and hurdle rates. So this goes into it in great depth. So I just looked at page 9 and we can see some of it. So if you look at page 9 there, you can see using RAROC as a key performance indicator. So this is a report by McKinsey. Is Miguel giving out QCCI, is it?
Yes.
Well done, Miguel.
Yeah.
So the second paragraph of this McKinsey report, and if you want copies of this, if you speak to Miguel, I'll give him the website link, and he can print it out. But as I say, it's another 20 pages, which would be going in your folders on a topic where really you just need an understanding of those couple of pages that we've got there. Good morning to the people who are just joining us. And then can you see on page 9 of the second paragraph, RAROC normalizes financial performance by the amount of risk undertaken. So going back to our discussion on RAROC last week, and we discussed, different divisions within the bank or different business units, obviously using capital. Capital is a scarce resource in any business, including banks, of course, and we're always interested in what return we get on capital. So the traditional way of measuring this would be to look at profit, relative to the capital that's being utilized. So what this is a more sophisticated measurement. So instead of just looking simply at what profit you're making on the capital that's being employed, what this is it's a risk adjustment. So what the Treasury people have to try and do is to identify different levels of risk, for example, within the credit portfolio, or within operational risk, or within market risk, which David started with you, and then there's a complex mathematical calculation which will price the risk of the capital being used by a certain division. I don't know if that helps make it any clearer or not. So let's have a look at what we have here. So if we just go back to the slides that I gave you, let's see if that sums it up. So we're on slide 9 in enterprise-wide risk management. And it's just after that one where we had the grid that we used on the variance plan case. Everybody found that? Yeah, good. So here we are, risk-adjusted performance. So it's a measurement to adjust the return of a product or business line versus the specific risk it was taken to earn that return. So I think you'll agree it's quite a complex mathematical calculation. Anyone in the room or financial institution actually using RAROC? Could you put your hand up if you're using it? Anyone know of the bank using it? No? Anyone from the central bank seen it during their inspections in Nassau? Anyone seen it being used?
No.
Not yet. Yes. Well, it is, it is quite a modern methodology, and it's like all of these things, we won't ever throw away the old ways of measuring things, but what we're trying to do here is capture the risk that's being taken by the division. So the concept, once again, it's RAROC or RORAC, R-O-R-A-C, and it's the risk-adjusted return on capital. So it's a risk measurement that adjusts the returns or the profits for risk. And the idea being, if we do this complicated mathematics, it will give us, and I think the right word to write on the slide, opposite the top there, is it will give you an indication, and it's an indicator only, of which product or business line is performing best in relation to risk, because the mathematics are so complex. People will argue against the mathematical calculation. It can be used as another methodology for allocating bonuses, as opposed to when we looked at Nick Leeson reportedly making huge profits in Singapore when he's actually making no profits at all. It can be also used for directors in decision making with allocating the financial institution's capital, because as we say, capital is a scarce resource. You know, if the risks that are being taken by a certain division are very high relative to the returns they're making, then it becomes a business area decision by the directors. Do we keep this particular business or do we dissolve it? So once again, you know, it's a management tool, but it's quite a sophisticated tool. That's about as far as we got last week. We started to talk, as we're closing, about the complexity of risk and the complexity of enterprise-wide risk management. And again, on this slide, if you want to make a note, under Basel III, this is now being called firm-wide risk management. So I'm no way using the term enterprise-wide risk management. That's because when we first started this in 2004 was our first seminar on enterprise-wide risk management, and that was the term that we used. Basel III are coming along now talking about firm-wide risk management, but it's exactly the same thing. So we discussed market risk very briefly, and you'll have, you know, a whole module on that from David Snyder, where he talked about the types of risks you can face, you know, interest rate movement, commodity risks, all these different things. Credit risk, I will do some credit risk issues with you, and as I said last week, the bad news when you look at the credit risk profiling there is the best you can do in credit is to get your money back. The rest of it's all downside risk. So that's why credit is so difficult in lots and lots of commercial banks. Operational risk, you can win or you can lose depending on the circumstances, and then of course if there's some type of catastrophe there, you'll see that's all downside risk. So mathematically, if we spend, you know, weeks and weeks and months doing sophisticated financial models, and then we put them all together, what we'll see is the total risk is a downside scenario. So that's why the job of compliance is so important nowadays, and of course of the risk manager, very, very important, or the risk director. Okay, now what we're going to do is look at some risk road maps, which again will give us an overview of how these things can be tackled. So if you're looking at this for the first time in your organization in terms of compliance or in terms of risk management, and we're taking a fresh look at credit, here is what we could start with. On this roadmap, what we could do immediately is take a look at the key credit policies that have been approved. Now, where would we find this in the bank? What document would we be looking for? Any ideas?
Lending policy.
Yeah, lending policy, very good. Or credit policy guide, whatever type of words are being used. And of course, the visiting central bank people will be, this will be one of the documents they'll be asking for. So what sort of things would we expect to be in the front of the credit policy guide or the lending guide or the lending policy? Would you expect lots of procedures immediately, or what do you think you'd expect? Well, the word policy should give us a clue. What would you expect to be in the front? Well, it should start, as we said last week, you know, the tone has got to be set from the top, yes? So what would we expect right in the front of the credit policy guide or the lending policy guide? There should be a statement by whom? Yeah, exactly. Very good. Yeah. I'm not trying to trick you. Time's too short to ask you any questions that would be a trick. Yeah. So most of this would be common sense. Yeah. So the thing we'd expect when we open the credit policy guide, if it's paper-based, you know, or if it's housed on the corporate intranet. The starting point we would expect would be statements by the directors on what their credit policies are. So what sort of things do you think would be in there if we were looking at these credit policies? Now, one of you ladies, at least one of you has done the credit professional course, so you should know this, if you can remember, because we did a lot of stuff on that program. Come on, it's not a trick question. What sort of thing would we expect to be in the statement by the directors? Thinking about credit, what sort of things would influence the credit policy? Or the credit risk? So we're looking at this from a risk perspective, yes? And we're looking at how the institution is handling the credit or the lending. What sort of things would we expect to be stated in a policy guide to begin with? What would be a prudential way of handling credit from a risk perspective? Any ideas?
The term of the loan?
Somebody had some comment towards about it?
The mic is there, yeah.
Sorry, I can't hear you right at the back there.
Yeah. Probably the terms of the loan.
Oh, we've got a man joined us.
Yeah.
I could just see a glimpse of your red shirt. Yeah?
Yes, sir.
Tell me that again, please. I didn't quite catch it.
Maybe the terms that you would control how long your money's be out for, the term of a loan.
Yeah, very good. Now that's a slightly more detailed aspect. So yes, but it would be in there.
The interest rate.
What sort of things would we begin with?
Client.
I mean, do you think all the banks' credit should be to the same categories of borrowers?
No.
No, so I'm giving you a clue there. Yes, so there should be a statement about the categorization of borrowers, yes?
Yeah.
And from a risk perspective, should that be quantified in some way?
Yeah, probably interest rate.
Yeah, very good. So you, for example, tourism very dominant in Nassau. I mean, would we try to put some maximum percentage on the loans that we're making to people, for example, who work in the tourism sector? Yeah, it'd be sensible, wouldn't it, from a risk perspective, yes?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, tourism is up and down. Most of the time we're hoping it's up, and you're getting more visitors. But what the Basel Committee would refer to is a concentration. So if you want to make a note on that slide, this is concentration risk. A concentration risk sounds complicated, but it's not. It's just a concentration of a number of loans in a particular way. Yeah? So one concentration, an obvious one for you there, would be the loan exposure to tourism sector. Okay, I'll give you that one. Anyone think of another one?
Civil servants.
Yes, civil servants. Yeah. Sorry, excuse me, Alvin. Or would you bracket politicians in with civil servants, or are they just another sector? Yeah, another sector, yeah.
Yeah.
So we could have a sector for people working in government, yeah?
Yeah.
What else could we classify?
Small businesses.
Yes, we could then start to move towards some of the things getting on the back was saying, where we could look like at the term of our lendings, yes? We might want to put stipulation in what's the maximum loan life, yeah? Might be 15 years, 20 years. And then we could look another sector which is very susceptible to economic downturns, of course, is property and construction, isn't it? Yeah? When times are good, people are buying and building more properties, etc. And then of course when we have downturns in the economy, this is one of the sectors that runs into problems. So that's the general idea, okay? Now you don't have to think of all this because you're the risk managers. You know, this is the director's job, not your job. But having said that, if you're the risk manager or the compliance officer and you've called for the bank's lending policy, first of all, or lending guide or credit policy guide, the first thing is we hope that they've got one, yes? You know, if they haven't got one, that's a bad mark straight away, isn't it, in terms of risk management? So we call for it, and your expectation as risk manager should be that we'll see this overview. You know, maybe the first 2 or 3 pages, or 5 or 6 pages in the document should be setting the scene. Yeah? What the policies are, what the sector exposures are. What about a maximum exposure to one group of countries, yeah? Now, a classic example of this, I've worked in Africa quite a few times. I was working in Zimbabwe many years ago where one bank in Zimbabwe lent so much money to one customer, if this customer went down, the bank went down. Now you could say, well, what was the central bank doing? Well, the central bank were trying to do a good job, but they didn't know about this, yeah? It hadn't been reported to them, and unfortunately, when they made the site visit, they missed it. So again, that's a concentration, isn't it? And it's risk management again. So our initial period would be to review the key credit risk policies and make sure they're approved by the directors. Everybody okay on that? So it's credit risk roadmap. Then within period one could be 3 months, it could be a year, depending on the time scale of the institution. Then we would encourage as risk managers that data is collected and what sort of systems do we have for managing the credit risk. So that's a period of improvement and recommendations. Then period 2 would be looking at these processes and making sure they were in alignment with the initial credit policies that were approved. In other words, we don't want to go off at a tangent, collecting lots and lots of data, buying lots of sophisticated technology that doesn't fit, with the original plan. Because you know as well as I do, Bank Bahamas, for example, they're going to have lots of credit exposure, whereas some of the other banks will have much lesser. Commonwealth Bank, I would think, have very high levels of credit exposure. So you'd expect banks like the 2 I've mentioned have much more detailed model systems and processes than other banks where they have only a modest credit exposure. Then when we've got all this pulled together, period 3 is where we can start to more actively manage the risk in the loan portfolio, right? So all of this leads us to improve risk management, and what we're talking about at the moment is improving credit risk management, which is very, very important in lots of banks right across the world. I've mentioned this figure already. Some banks will have as much as 70 to 80% of all the assets in the balance sheet tied up in the lending portfolio. So take a look when you get back to work, look at your balance sheet, look at all the assets, and just look at what the lending portfolio is, and then simply on the calculator just work that as a percentage of the total assets. And if it comes out to 70 to 80% or 60 to 70%, you can see that this section of risk management will be extremely important. If you're only 5 or 10%, well then it won't be as important, will it? If there'll be other sections it's more important. But active portfolio management is very, very hard to do, unless we've got good policies in place and unless we've got good data systems in place. Now, market risk would be the same. Now, I'm not going to say too much about this because David started with our 3 sessions with you exclusively and specifically on market risk. And looking at my chart here, I believe that's module 4. Yeah, David's got it. David's very, very experienced, previously an accountant, and he's worked for many, many years in financial specialism. So market risk models, again, how sophisticated these will need to be will dependent on your organization or the organization that you're looking at, the central bank, and their exposure to market risk. Some institutions will have very, very little exposure to market risk, some others will have a lot. So same process, looking at controls, then looking at the portfolio. Can it be tested? For example, if the bank is very susceptible to movements in interest rate, that would be a good market risk stress testing on the portfolio and modeling different scenarios on that. Now, credit risk is difficult, but we've had lots of experience in doing it for many, many years. Market risk is a bit newer in terms of risk management, and that's quite difficult. But operational risk has been with us forever, but actually, you might be surprised to know that even the most sophisticated banks in the whole world, this is the section that they have the most problems with. Operational risk management. Why could that be? Anybody got any ideas? Why would operational risk be so difficult to manage? Because
operations keeps changing.
Yeah.
Trends.
Yeah, because operations keep changing, that's one thing. So there'll be changing trends. What else? What type of operational risk events might we face? Are they all the same? No. Yeah, they're all going to be different. Will they be all the same size? No. And will they all have the same impact? No, I mean, Barron's Bank, that was disastrous, wasn't it? It killed the bank. It's young man aged 27 years of age. So operational risk is difficult. We'll talk more about this when we look in more depth at operational risk. But what we do need is to develop good databases on operational risk. What some banks do is they have returns from all of the branches coming into head office, and someone in head office will collate these risks and develop a master risk register, trying to see the frequency of events that are affecting the bank and the severity of the events. So it's a good thing to build up a risk register. I'll give you an example of a risk register a bit later on. So if we have a chief risk officer appointed, and many years ago this appointment just did not exist, but nowadays it's a modern appointment because risk is becoming more and more important. So if we've got a chief risk officer, what are the sort of things that person would do in terms of quantitative aspects? Well, they should have some type of risk oversight committee. There should be policies and procedures. There should be procedures in place for risk assessment. There should be measurement within the risk register and reporting. There should be definitely risk limits. There'd be credit risk limits. There'd be market risk limits. We need a good audit process, and if you mark again on the slide, internal audit, that would be the bank's inspection division. And then we have external audit, which is the bank's auditors. And then of course, the third on to this would be the central bank site visits, yes? So 3 types of auditing there: internal, external auditors, and site visits. And then systems will be key in place of the risk management. Now in terms of the qualitative side of the job, the chief risk officer, the job is to try and create risk awareness within the organization. And then the difficult part, communicating the risk awareness, communicating the risk policies to the people. And then what about the skills of the people working in risks? What about the integrity of the organization? And we'll come on to that in a few minutes with the BCCI case study. How is the organization driven by incentives? And what about the culture and values within the system? Now, in terms of the timescale for the risk implementation plan, we've been talking about looking at credit risk, looking at market risk, looking at operational risk. They're the three main areas. Then the first part, the suggestion is it would take us a minimum of 6 months to look at what processes are in place, to look at what data we have in place, and then can we see that expression gap analysis? You've probably come across this term before. It's simply looking for gaps in the process. It's looking for gaps in the analysis of the data, and then trying to pull this together in terms of an enterprise-wide risk assessment. So you can see this is a complicated thing. It's not an easy thing to achieve. Phase 2 would be coming up with work plans and metrics, how we're going to measure these sort of things. So what's the vision for developing risk management procedures? How can we implement this? What plans can we put in place? And then what are the final recommendations from this, and this linking, as you can see, into the Chief Risk Officer there. So if we do all of these things, what sort of output are we hoping for? Because it's always a good thing to look at, what we're hoping to deliver from all of this hard work. So key deliverables. Now this will vary with the organisation, but here's an example of some of the things we could be hoping for. Risk catalogue or risk register, right there, risk register. Some people call it a risk log of events. What we want to find from the risk register is to identify and prioritize what our key risks are within the organisation that we'll be reviewing. We need to be assessing, as we said, the current risk management practices. We might find, they're perfect. They're all top-notch processes, so it'll be very hard to come up with something for improvement. But generally we're going to find some gaps there relative to best practices. What's the vision for an enterprise risk management framework within the organisation? And a few years ago we did come up with some suggestions through our consulting network, Fullbank Bahamas, who is sitting present at the moment there. And then we have high-level enterprise risk management risk report. This would be the committee level and board of directors level. And then, multi-year work plan to try and close the gap between current and desired state of risk management. Now, I know these are all very generic ideas, but that's the starting point in terms of our risk management. So if we're trying to do this, and it's going to be very difficult, what are some of the critical success factors that we need to be aware of? Now, I think this list is important, and you can probably add to this list based on your own experiences in your organisation. And you'll see point 1 there. I've mentioned this at least 3 or 4 times already. This risk management has got to come from the leadership. The tone has got to be set from the top. Yeah? So the lady at the back there is talking about compliance. It would be absolutely hopeless if risk management in the organisation is trying to be driven by the compliance officer. That's not the compliance officer's job. The compliance officer as a big job, trying to make sure things are compliant, things are moving, things are keeping up to date. It's certainly not their job to set the tone of risk management from the top of the organisation. That's for the directors to do. Yeah, that's one of the directors' jobs, is to set this risk management. Second job for the director is to allocate resources for enterprise risk management. And then that will illustrate how serious they are about improving risk management. Again, from the directors, what's the vision for risk management and what's the overall plan? And then here's the time scale. Can we have some milestones and can we have some individual accountability? And it's at this point where you would generally see reference to people like the compliance people within the organisation and the auditors, etc. So implementing an effective risk policy involves the risk management overall. We've already mentioned this. Involves looking at the balance sheet as a very complex interest rate arbitrage, because funds are obtained from many different sources at different interest rates and employed in a wide variety of assets to try and earn interest or commissions or whatever we're doing to produce the profit. So inherent in that balance sheet will be lots and lots of processes that will affect the risk, just as in the case we saw of Nick Newsom, where the assets that he was trading were extremely volatile, although he was telling the directors they were very low risk products, and these things need to be understood by the risk manager. And also you might like to make a note on there, and also by the directors, because remember in the Barings Bank case the risks weren't understood, were they, by the directors. So it is very, very important, because prudent management of any institution will be a reflection of the ability of the institution to balance successfully the risk in the portfolio with profit earned on it. And we talked about this. It's all about risk versus return. If you're taking higher risks, you'd expect higher return. If you're taking low risks, you'd expect lower returns. And it's a warning flag when someone tries to explain to you, if you're the risk manager, and someone tries to explain to you, oh, well, we're making very high returns, but we have a very low risk position. That doesn't make sense. So the fundamental purpose of management is to develop good business for the institution with a known and acceptable level of risk. So you can underline that. Known is very important. Acceptable is very important. Do we know the risk? Is it acceptable risk? Going back to our policy guide. What controls do we need to mitigate the risk? And are we getting an acceptable return relative to the risks that we're taking? So the prime vision when writing these policies is to determine the institution's tolerance for accepting risk and articulate it when defining the risk parameters of the policy. Now my next sentence is important, you should underline this. Each institution is unique, and this must be reflected in its policy. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Depending on the risk, it should be reflected within the policy guides that you're looking at. And the policy should reflect the collective risk tolerance of senior managers and board of directors. And again, you can underline the next part, which may vary from extremely conservative to very aggressive. And you know this yourselves in Nassau, different organizations have different risk tolerance levels. And And the difficulty in working in any financial institution is where the risk tolerance changes, isn't it? You know, the organisation you're working for might be quite cautious, and then you might get a new chief executive coming in. What does he decide to do? You know, drive the business forward. And of course that's risky, isn't it? Because it's a change of direction. Now, if it's done properly, of course it's a good thing for the business, but if it's done slightly recklessly, you know, it's going to be very, very risky. So these things have got to be looked at carefully. When I saw a statement in press many years ago when I was working on a program in Malaysia, I opened the press and new chief executive was appointed of this company listed on Malaysian Stock Exchange. The name of it was Sine Darby, won't mean anything to you there, but they were involved in rubber plantations, in housing, in tire manufacture, lots of different things. The headline in the newspaper was a quote from the chief executive. You have to bear in mind this company was number 1 on the stock exchange, and the quote from the new chief executive was, "I'm going to wake up the sleepy giant." So, how would you feel as risk managers if you saw that statement? Well, I think you feel slightly worried because, first of all, how does he perceive our business as a sleepy giant when we're number 1 in the stock market? So we must be doing something right, yeah? Maybe he's going to wake us up, goodness me. I'm in for a shock here, yeah? So, anyway, I'll cut a long story short, what he did in the end was he decided, because they were in rubber plantations, they were in tire manufacture, because of the land banks, they went into housing, because they were in housing, they went into insurance, and so it goes on and on and on. And then in the end, the final thing that got into a lot of trouble was he bought a bank. He decided he'd buy a bank. So he bought the 4th largest bank in Malaysia. And of course this man, he was so confident, you know, waking everybody up. They bought the bank without proper due diligence. I know this sounds ridiculous. And when they took over the bank, they found the bank was riddled with credit problems. So what happened was the stock market, the shares, the prices collapsed. And this company, previously, and this is a huge amount of money, it was Malaysian money, but still a lot, they had $1 billion of cash reserves in this company, and it went down to 1. Now they didn't go broke, but they were delisted from the stock exchange. The share trading was suspended. This guy got sacked, obviously. Then the new people coming in, I mean, they managed to rebuild the business because it had some very, very good business units. So this aspect of policy, this aspect of conservative to aggressive, you know, to very much a warning signal for us working in risk management. And the problem we have in Barclays when I was working in risk, I should not say too much because I've just remembered, I think the guy was recording me again. And I got into terrible trouble a few weeks ago when I was talking about President Obama. The girl was threatening to report me. It wasn't a bad thing, I said. Said he was trying to make changes. So, the importance is the risk committee's policy should also address who's responsible for capital management, who's responsible for managing the institution's capital position. You know, is it the Treasury? Is it Treasury plus Asset and Liability Committee? You've heard of this ALCO committee. You've seen that? ALCO standing for Asset and Liability Committee. You know, their job is intended to be managing the assets and the liabilities. And then, what sort of controls will we have for divisional businesses and limits, and also looking over our shoulder, as we said earlier, to look at downturn risks. What's our exposure into these different industries, and what will happen if there's a downturn in that particular mix of industries. So traditionally then, if traditionally we're looking at the institution, what we would be doing traditionally is looking at the risks we're taking calculated risk decisions, and then we would hope to get a return, which is a profit on the capital we're employing. So that's a traditional way to creating value. Everybody talks about creating value in today's modern world. Economic value added is what we've been touching on already with the RORAC and the RAROC. So economic value added is the comparison of the after-tax profit with the company's cost of capital. So again, this measurement is developed by the US analyst Stewart, and it's meant to give an alternative or supplementary method of reviewing corporate performance. So it's the after-tax profit compared to the company's cost of capital. So another mathematical calculation. So we just said that there. I'll repeat the job. Now this slide would be worthy of an asterisk because you might expect the examiner, I think, would be very tempted, because Module 1 is all about enterprise-wide risk management. It could be very tempted, I think, to ask you a question with a few different answers on what actually enterprise risk management is, yes? So enterprise risk management is a process effected by an entity's board of directors, management and other personnel applied in strategy setting and across the enterprise, designed to identify potential events that may affect the entity and to manage risks within its risk appetite and to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of these entities' objectives. Now we're going to come on to a little bit more detail on this, but can you see at the bottom of my slide I've put the source for you there, COSO, C-O-S-O. Now COSO is not to be confused with IOSCO, the international organization. COSO, again, if you have a chance to do a web search, if you don't have time, I'll give you the reference next week. But COSO is an American organization that first published an integrated framework for risk management. We're going to see that in a few moments. Let me see if I can find it. Here we are, yes. So if we jump forward a few slides to slide 32, you'll see the COSO approach is to split enterprise risk management into these four headings. So again, we're not saying that this is the right approach, and when we look at Basel, we're not saying, well, Basel, is the only approach. What we're offering here is some alternative approaches. So the COSO approach is to split into these four objectives: strategic objectives, operational objectives, reporting objectives, and for the compliance people, the compliance objectives. And again, on the website, and it's a bit difficult to see this on my screen, I don't know how clear it is on the slides that Miguel has done for you. Can you read it, or do you need an enlargement? Judging by people peering at this, I think we'll ask Miguel for an enlargement then of slide number 33. Now when he comes up, I'll get him to do an enlargement for you. So this is the COSO cube. Okay? So the idea of the COSO cube is you can use this in terms of a strategy for enterprise risk management. So can you see on the front of the cube there, we've got objective settings, internal environment, event identification, risk assurances, the risk of risk responses, control activities, and information communication, and monitoring on the bottom there. Now, you can also see that it can be enterprise level. This is on the right-hand side of the cube. It can be division or subsidiary level. It can be business unit level. So there's an expansion there, or it could be in a subsidiary company as well. So it's a very thorough assessment on this cube. And what COSO are suggesting to us is these 8 components of the framework are interrelated. So this is another way of looking at it, looking at this COSO framework. Now here's another source for you. This time it's from the Institute of Internal Auditors, and I found this a long time ago in 1998. This is their business risk assessment framework. And the recommendation by the Institute of Internal Auditors is risk assessment, risk management, and risk monitoring. Everybody see that framework there? So under the assessment of risk, we'll be wanting to identify the risks, to measure the risks, and then to prioritize our risk management. We control it. Can we share the risk or transfer it? Or can we avoid it, or can we diversify the risk in some way? So that's the risk management. And then finally on the right hand side, the monitoring activity, monitoring processes, activities, and entities. Okay, well I've talked now for just about 1 hour non-stop, so I think what we'll do at this stage is keeping that framework in front of us. Let's take a look at the BCCI case study, which I hope you all got copies of. Now BCCI, just like the Barron's Bank that we looked at, BCCI is quite a famous or infamous case, and you can see it was a huge amount, $10 billion general fraud. So what I'd like you to do is read through this individually and mark things up that catch your eye in terms of risk management. It'll take you probably about 10 minutes to read this through, and then we'll have a discussion after you've read it through, okay? So I'll just mute my microphone for a moment or two. I talked to Miguel, your refreshment should be coming in soon. Are you reading the case study? Just a few more minutes to finish reading it through. So as you can see, from the final page, page 3, we're looking for what lessons about risk management can we learn from this case study. So you can imagine as a lawyer getting involved with this. You'd be busy for years and years.
Actually, I read the judgment, right? There was a judgment.
You did?
Yeah,
Yes.
it was.
How interesting. When did you read that?
About 2 years ago, it was different. Yeah, it was, I think the men's was
Yeah. So you were studying that as part of your legal exams?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see from the postscript developed that with this, caused severe embarrassment to the Bank of England, as a regulatory body. And that's one of the reasons why the FSA was set up in the UK, to handle regulation. Because they've missed cases like Barings Bank and then this BCCI. And now, of course, as I told you last week, FSA are being disbanded, and there'll be 2 different wings which will report back into the Bank of England. So controls gone full circle back to the Bank of England. One is the Financial Conduct Authority and the other is the Prudential Regulatory Authority. But I'll give you that website reference when we look at some of the Basel III stuff next week. Okay, so first page, some things caught your eye there?
Shell company?
Yeah, companies all over the place, yeah. So that would be a nightmare in terms of risk management. What about the second paragraph there?
Dubious lending, fraudulent record keeping, rogue trading, fluffing up my money laundering.
Ownership regulations, money laundering, goodness me. So that all needs underlying. The dubious lending, fraudulent record keeping, rogue trading, flouting with bank ownership, regulations, and money laundering. Goodness me. Now here's a key point, look. Why wasn't this spotted? Well, you mentioned shell companies, but the bank structure and deal making was so complex that a decade after the institution was liquidated, its activities are still not fully understood. So this is a web of intrigue. And the third paragraph's interesting, and why we put this case in as part of enterprise-wide risk management, because one way to think, this third paragraph, one way to think of BCCI is an attempt to create the opposite of a firm with integrated risk management practices, yeah? So all the things we've been talking about when we're trying to create firm-wide risk management or enterprise risk management, a good practice basis, BCCI is the opposite. In this case, certain senior bank personnel and interested parties did not simply overlook risk, but manipulated gaps in the bank's risk management structure and between its subsidiaries to serve various purposes. Terrible, eh?
Yeah, because you think people in charge would be the ones to
To set the tone.
Yeah.
Yeah, like we said earlier, yeah. To set the policies, identify the risks, but actually, when the tone from the top is a tone of intrigue and deceit, it's going to be terribly, terribly difficult. And the lady at the back mentioning compliance. And imagine being a compliance officer working in BCCI. Goodness, maybe your worst nightmare, wouldn't it? Only good thing, I guess, would be getting your paycheck and then trying not to worry too much about what's going to happen next. It would be a dreadful job. So what this would put it at a disadvantage other stakeholders, such as the million or so depositors, and again look at that expression around the world. And here's something interesting, certain institutional depositors attracted by, here we go, BCCI's relatively high rates, which provided much of the bank's funding. Now just digressing for a second here, some of this funding, was by by treasurers of what we call local authorities. So in the UK, we have lots of different counties, like Sussex, Surrey, Northumberland, blah blah blah, and these typically will have a local authority, to assist with the management, and usually they have very skilled people who act as treasurers of the funds within that local region. And these people as well, some of these people as well, should have known better, shouldn't they? And they were investing the public's money in BCCI. Why? Because BCCI were offering high interest rates for the deposits. And supposedly, once again, low risk. Meanwhile, other bank officers had little understanding of the bank's structure and overall financial position. And here we go, look, and we're encouraged. We're encouraged not to question bank practices or the reason for the flow of funds between bank entities. Goodness me. So there you are, working in compliance, trying to do a good job, but you're being encouraged not to question things. Not to question why we're doing it. Not to question the flow of funds between these entities. So some of the story I did an abridged version for you, but you can see straight away. So here's a man, Pakistan banker with Arab banking, forms the Bank of Commerce, Credit and Commerce. Where was the institution chartered? In Luxembourg, which those of you who know Europe, Luxembourg's a tiny, tiny state, quite close to Switzerland in Europe, but it's a tiny place. Why would they be headquartered in Luxembourg? Well, because of secrecy, traditionally a very secretive place. But its treasury and other key functions, look at where they're based. Cayman Islands, not too far from you guys. And in London, before moving to Abu Dhabi in 1990. Goodness me. So just that opening few lines gives you an indication, of the complexity. You can imagine, being a regulator, you wouldn't really know where to start. So branches and subsidiaries in 70 different countries. So who's responsible for regulating this? This is the problem. And this is still a key issue for the central banks today, where we get these complicated structures involving many jurisdictions, and it's a really big problem for the regulators in trying to control these types of things. So 70 different countries, complex structure of holding companies, cross-holdings, and nominee owners. BCCI's international nature helped the company avoid a large amount of regulation because for most of its history, no single regulator or audit team had full jurisdiction over it. So very difficult. Now this is the next part where it starts to get a bit sticky. And this is what you like in Nassau, like a bit of scandal, don't you? So although institutions such as the CIA and the Bank of England reportedly had some knowledge of their activities, regulators worldwide, including a special college of regulators, set up to oversee the institution, proved unable to take early and decisive action against the bank. Regulation was made difficult by inadequate communication amongst agencies and, here's a part worth underline, by the high-level government connections that the BCCI leaders cultivated. Gosh, where have we heard that one before? Although they may not have endorsed the bank's activities, various influential figures in the US and around the world overlooked signs that could have exposed the scandal before 1991, and this lent the institution a veneer of respectability. Are you familiar with the term veneer? Yeah, it's just like a coating, isn't it? Yeah, veneer is like a coating of respectability. One such signs was the bank's involvement in money laundering and financing of arms trafficking. BCCI's presence in Kenya, Cayman Islands and many offices around the world made it a useful route for tainted funds. Clients involved such figures as former Panamanian director, as well as individuals who were, we should say, allegedly, we just mark out there on page 1, who were allegedly, our lawyer will know why I'm putting that in, were allegedly involved in various drug and crime cartels. American enforcement officials had uncovered evidence of these transactions, but did not act on them until 1988. At that point, the US Customs Service completed an undercover operation that led to the arrest of several BCCI figures who were convicted of money laundering. The bank itself pleaded guilty to the laundering charge and was fined $14 million, which isn't very much by some recent fines we've seen recently in financial services, but it was a lot at the time. The bank's international web began to unravel when Regardis, a Washington-based business magazine, published a story that questioned BCCI links with the owners of a significant US bank, First American. This Reserve made an official probe into this alleged connection. In March 2091, BCCI admitted that it had acquired a 25% stake in First American without the approval of regulators. The Fed then ordered BCCI to sell the shares in question. Investigations continued in the US and separately in London. In June, Price Waterhouse, a principal BCCI auditor, informed the Bank of England that it had found evidence of widespread fraud and account juggling in BCCI's operations. The auditors came to believe that despite its pace of growth, the bank may never have made a profit in the whole of its 19 years existence. Goodness me. There's some creative accounting going on there. Now the next bit goes right back to our earlier discussion about credit and credit risks and credit policies. So throughout its history, BCCI have made large loans to companies and individuals without properly securing them. These loans represented massive concentrations of credit risk. You need to underline that, but were often not properly documented or monitored. When these loans went bad, the bank had no legal recourse and was forced to absorb losses. This strategy ran counter to the common sense and all principles of good lending and brought with huge losses for BCCI. BCCI covered up this problem by taking in new deposits and not recording these on its books. So they created a matrix of false accounts that had losses for years. We'll stop there a while, Miguel.
This is the fine takeover case study.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel. Did you bring the food up as well?
Come right now.
Okay, let's just take a 5-minute break while you get your food because that's coming up. And then we'll continue with the BCCI case, so just 5-minute break. So has the sound been quite clear so far? For a moment, ladies, and get some refreshments. Just move yourself for 5 minutes and then we'll continue.
Yes.
You can bring your food back to the table.
Yeah.
So what has he got for you this week? You had chicken sauce last week?
I know.
Wonder what he's got this week? Miguel's menu. Okay. So what's on Miguel's menu today with Miguel?
Curry chicken.
Curry chicken. Wow. I wish I was there again. Tuesday favourite things on this. Presumably some rice with the curry chicken. The first person morning. Come on, help yourself and then bring it back to the table and then we can continue. Oh, so it's not ready yet? Okay, sorry. Okay, well let's continue on the case. So we're talking about, these huge loan losses that were covering it up by when new deposits were coming in. They created false accounts, and then obviously the cash flow, from those deposits, they were using those to cover up the loan losses that were being made. So another way that BCCI lost money was through huge losses in the Treasury Department. Well, these losses may themselves have been a way of disguising other losses and misdoings. BCCI also reportedly lost hundreds of millions of dollars through a financial services trading company that it set up. Goodness me. Ironically, BCCI itself lost huge amounts of money in a series of illegal US bank acquisitions and from improperly secured loans underpinning them that led to investigation and disclosure. And then it goes on a bit about the American side. And then on page 3, what I started to do was try and summarize the timelines for that.
Is that everything?
So BCCI, when I did this, I had a little 30 years of trouble, whereas we're now in 2014. It's 40 years of trouble. 40 years of trouble. We were founded in 1972.
Years without any kind of regulation or anything like that, without being detected by a government body. I don't understand that.
No, I don't know it. And there you go. Well, I mean, the excuses are all there. I put excuses in for you. One of the major problems was the accountability. Who was accountable for regulating BCCI? And you see further down, the Bank of England got into terrible trouble over this case. And you can see that figures from Wikipedia. The Bank of England had a lawsuit, $1 billion lawsuit against them as a regulatory body failing to do the duties. So your question is very, very apt. Your question is very, very correct. And of course the Bank of England had a terrible problem with this case. But in the end, as you can see, the Bank of England maintained statutory immunity on the case. Those studies, what was you read? What was the conclusion on the part that you read? Did you make any conclusions over the role of the Bank of England in your legal studies? Sorry. I was saying, the last part there on page 3 about the Bank of England, when you read it from your legal papers, what was the conclusion? Was there any conclusion about the role of the Bank of England mentioned?
There was a conclusion that judgment was still long and acting.
Say again?
I said that the judgment was still long and acting.
Yeah, oh yes, okay. Yeah, it'd be massive, yeah. So was it hundreds of pages?
Yes.
Yeah, hundreds of pages, yeah. Yeah, I tried to summarize this case into 3 pages. But you know, the whole thing's probably about 300 pages or more. Yeah. So to answer the question is difficult to answer. And in terms of risk management, the only things we can do is to try and look where we think people went wrong. Well, where they went wrong really is that somebody somewhere should have accepted the overall responsibility, shouldn't they, as regulator? Yeah, and they should have pursued it. You know, it's no use in life when you see something that's extremely complicated, giving up on it, yeah? You know, it's a series of people giving up. So, you know, the US gave up, the Bank of England, as you can see, didn't do an effective job. And of course, all of this was made even more difficult by what we read about the bank. You're cultivating relationships with very senior, influential people in the US around the world. So it was a very, very difficult case. Very difficult case to spot. So hopefully your work in risk management will be much more straightforward than a case like this. I hope so anyway.
Situation like this, and I mean, this is a question for,
Yeah.
I guess, everyone in the world.
Yeah.
In a situation like this, wouldn't they bring action against individuals involved if it's this complex?
Well,
Because I mean, when you look at this, the anti-money laundering policy is out the window,
Yes,
and even
yeah.
that by itself, as a
Yeah.
court category by itself, has penalties involved. So you would think that they would have brought action against individuals who are involved in this.
It's a those post-modern, blacklisting. Within 1990.
Yeah.
You're thinking post-fire.
yeah, that's
Prior to that.
interesting. So nowadays, my answer was going to be, well, nowadays, most definitely, yes.
Right.
Because, you know, we see a series of cases against people as individuals, yeah? So individuals are now being held much more responsible. This case is old, but it raises all the issues that at this time, individuals definitely should have been brought forward. I mean, in the UK now, and we will talk about it, just a very, very recent UK case next week. Individuals are being brought forward and interviewed by the UK Parliament Commission. You know, they'll be asked about their actions. For example, the Fraud Bank of Scotland, Goodwin, the Peter Gangler, was more or less interrogated by Parliament on a series of questions and misdoings. HPOS, Halifax Bank of Scotland, individuals brought forward, and very recently, just in the last few weeks, which is the case we'll look at next week, the Reverend Flowers, who may have heard of him, chairman of the Cooperative Bank. Did I mention him briefly to you last week? Yeah. Roman Church minister for over 20 years, chairman of the bank. He's just been in front of the parliamentary committee as well. So yes, very good point. History shows us that this thing should have happened earlier. Okay, this will be foods ready. Good?
Acquisition of the 25%.
Yes,
without proper approval? Is this
Yeah.
because of the government connections? How
Well-
are they able to apply for 25% without proper approval?
exactly. So there's another example. How on earth would they do that without proper approval? Just like my example in Zimbabwe, Africa, how could the bank lend so much money to one customer, that if that customer went broke, the bank would go broke with the customer? Yeah, it's just nonsense, isn't it? It's a very good question again. How could they possibly gain 25%? Because we know how tough the US is now, aren't they?
I was last week.
You know, we've had all these recent acts.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. You know, if you sign up for audit of accounts as a director, you can, my understanding is, you now can be held personally responsible for the accuracy of those accounts. So there's a big change, yeah? So things have tightened up dramatically. And also in the UK, you know, the US is much more rules and regulation orientated than we are in the UK, but nevertheless in the UK things are becoming much tighter, and people are asking questions why. And actually, within the regulatory side, to become now a non-executive director of a financial institution in the UK, you've got to have your CV approved, or your bio approved by the Bank of England, and also you've got to be interviewed. You have to demonstrate that you're a fit person to become a non-executive director. We call them NED, NEDs in the UK, and that's the problem. Some of them have been NEDs in the past. You know, some of these people have known absolutely nothing about finance, become a non-executive of a financial institution, come to a board meeting where they're meeting just like you are now, you're having a spot of lunch, taking a bit of a discussion, and then the difference is they get a check from Miguel and go away. Yeah? Very happy until the next meeting. So that's the difference. So things are getting much tighter because we have had people here from retail background, and I don't mean retail credit, I mean retailers, as I mentioned last week, you know, becoming chief executives of financial institutions. Now, I'm not saying these people are not good business people, of course they are, but you know, working in finance is very different. In the banking, everybody says, you know, their own profession is very different, don't they? You know, talking to somebody in Atlantis, they say, oh, well, in the hotels are very different to your bank. Somebody in fishing will say they're very different to blah, blah, blah. But somebody in a restaurant. But the fact is that banking is very different, primarily because we're dealing with other people's money, aren't we? We're custodians, with depositors' money. So it is a complicated area. Okay. So BCCI, a real mess, the opposite of what we'd expect in terms of an enterprise-wide risk structure, the opposite of what we'd expect where we talked about, you know, good tone and good direction being set by the directors. It was the opposite, wasn't it? You know, they encouraged bad practices, yeah? And like we said, nowadays all of these directors, I would hope, would be listed, the names would be there, you know, they'd all be in front of the courts, wouldn't it, yeah? You know, they'd all be grilled by the Senate in the US, they'd be grilled by Parliament in the UK, and they'd be held, you know, these people would be held accountable for all of these wrongdoings and bad action. Terrible case. That's BCCI. Okay, let's go back to slides. Try and get it done. So in terms of risk analysis on BCCI, well, if you're a compliance or you're a risk manager or even a risk director, you can have a terrible time because you can see, you'll see some of the risk that's going on. You won't see all of them because a lot of them were very carefully concealed through shell companies, through all these different locations. Don't forget they're operating in 70 different countries. There's a web of deceit there that any one person would have a hell of a job trying to uncover. So there's no way you're going to manage it because you're never going to be able to identify it, are you? So you get stuck on the first box. So the first box on the left, risk assessment, you're never going to be able to assess the risks because you can't identify them. Why? Because of the complexity of the structures. So there's no way you're going to be measuring them because you can't identify them. You can't prioritize them because you can't identify them. So this framework provided by the Institute of Internal Auditors, you're going to get nowhere with it, are you? On a normal business, you can use the whole framework, but you're stuck top left, risk assessment and identification. You're not going to get any further than that in this particular case, hopeless case. So, when we're talking about trying to implement an effective policy, so not like the case that we've just been looking at, I talked a little bit last week about Basel II. Then we also had some enhancements to Basel II in July 2009. And then in 2010, we had the announcement that we're moving towards Basel III. And I did say to you last week that the way to think of Basel III is to think of it as enhancements to Basel II. Someone once said to me, Keith, it's like sticking plasters, adhesives that you administer. So if you think of Basel II, you stick different things on to try and patch it up, but I don't think that's a very good description. I think the better description is to think of Basel III as an enhancement of Basel II. And you'll see the enhancements don't come as any surprises. The enhancements are because of things that happened that weren't either properly covered under Basel II or the risk guidelines weren't sufficient under Basel II to prevent some of the things that we saw happening globally.
And he was the second one up there.
So the overarching goals in Basel II initially, back in 2004, were to ensure adequate capitalization of financial institutions. So that's worth underlining, because we'll see under Basel III that there's a lot of discussion about strengthening the balance sheet capital position. And then also Basel II wanted to encourage best practice risk management. So again, we see under Basel III an enhancement to this. Why? Because it hasn't worked in the way that the Basel Committee were hoping. Now there's been a lot of criticism of Basel II. People saying, well, what was the point of Basel II? It obviously didn't work because we had global crisis. I personally I don't work for the Basel Committee. I personally don't think that's justified because having studied Basel II a lot since it first came out, I do think there are lots and lots of very good things there. But the problem is back to what we saw with the BCCI case. If people don't want to play by the best practices, if people won't do and encourage these type of things, it's not going to work anyway, is it? Yeah? So, no matter how expensive the recommendations are, it's like the Bible, isn't it? The Bible making all these recommendations, but if people don't follow them, it's not the Bible's fault, is it? At the end of the day, it's the people's fault, isn't it? Probably gather I go to the Zion Church when I come to Nassau. I go to see Morrison.
I have a question. Would you have a situation that is used, when we studied
He's a
CCP,
character.
Chinese walls in an organization, because you have one area doing one thing and then another area doing something else that
Exactly.
is kind of compromising a policy, but they can't really say that.
Yes, yeah. Chinese walls, that's a tough one. For those people who haven't attended that particular program, yeah, you can have one division or one department undertaking a certain activity, and then there's another one where there's a conflict of interest. Yes? An example might be where one division are working with a rating agency, to provide a good rating analysis and research, and then another division might be in deal making, where they're not even following the own financial institution rating guidelines. So, and of course this has led recently to some of the cases we've seen in insider trading. And we'll look at an insider trading case next week, okay? Yeah, where this thing occurs. So very good point. So the key objectives then of Basel II were to promote safety and soundness. So again, you could say, well, that didn't work because we had a global crisis. To enhance competitive equality, you could say, well, that didn't work because of the disparity in different countries with their organisation structures. Apply a more comprehensive approach to risk. Well, that didn't work because we didn't understand CDOs, mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, all these things. And okay, it did create the framework of 3 pillars, but again, it didn't work with hindsight. So this was it. Now, once again, if you don't have an enlargement of this, if you can't read it, Miguel, I'm sure we'll print a larger one for you. Now this slide, it took me ages to do this, because what I wanted to try and do is create something where, for people who know nothing about Basel II, for example, yourselves trying to tell one of your colleagues just a bit about Basel II, please feel free to use this one short summary. I know I've shown it to some people before, as a framework, which I hope will help. So if we look right at the top, so Basel II was all about strategies for risk management. And you see straight away, instead of calling it 3 sections or 3 parts, they used the term pillar, P-I-L-L-A-R. So we had these 3 pillars. Pillar 1 was all about the capital strategy, all about the mathematics, all about the capital needed within the organization's balance sheet. So pillar 1 is all about the heavy mathematics, and we'll expand that in a moment. Pillar 2 is much more of interest to the people around the table, because that deals with regulation, it deals with compliance, it deals with creating a risk culture, it deals with risk management. So pillar 2 involves the risk events, involves creating databases, all of those things that we've been talking about. Pillar 1 is the more mathematical side. Pillar 3, yes, you need to know about it, because pillar 3 is the disclosure that the directors are making, generally through the financial statements, generally through the annual report and accounts. And there should be more and more disclosure about what risk management practices are being used within the organization. Yes, there will be press releases on the larger companies, there will be shareholders meetings, sometimes there are analyst presentations on the very large companies. So pillar 3 is all about encouraging disclosure and transparency, which is at very senior director level. Pillar 1 is all about the mathematics, in making sure, trying to make sure, is the right description, that the financial institution. Pillar 2 is more of our concern beyond this risk management program. So, if we look just briefly at the mathematics, then those of you who are interested in mathematics, I think I gave the reference on this before. It's www.bis.org. So www.bis.org, standing for Bank of International Settlements. And that's the Central Bank. And if you go on the home page, you'll see there's a sub-heading on the home page, Basel Publications. And that's what you want.